In 1945, the world celebrated peace. But for one nation, war had just begun. Do you believe World War II ended in 1945? For most of the world, yes. But not for Indonesia, because for them, the real war was just beginning. And this time, it wasn't about empires. It was about freedom. This war wasn't taught in your classroom. It wasn't covered in your textbooks, but it was bloody. It was real, and it changed a nation forever. So ask yourself, was 1945 truly the end, or just the beginning of something far more brutal for Indonesia? August 15th, 1945. The world exhaled, or so it seemed, but in Indonesia, a new struggle was just beginning. After over 300 years of brutal Dutch colonial rule, and 3 painful years under Japanese occupation, Indonesia stood at a crossroads. Japan's surrender created a power vacuum. The Dutch were weak. The Japanese were ordered to maintain order until Allied forces arrived. And the Indonesian people, fueled by rising nationalism, saw their chance. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break free. Just 2 days later, on August 17th, 1945, nationalist leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta declared Indonesia's independence. The red and white flag rose. The new Republic of Indonesia was born, but its birth was anything but peaceful. Why? Because the Dutch weren't ready to let go. Not yet. The Dutch government in exile, backed by Allied powers, especially the British, planned to reclaim what they still called the Dutch East Indies, but the Indonesian people had already made up their minds. They would fight, they would bleed, they would die before becoming a colony again. Enter the British, peacekeepers or enablers. The British arrived in late 1945. Their mission? Disarm Japanese troops. Repatriate prisoners of war. But for Indonesian, these British soldiers looked more like protectors of Dutch colonialism. Tension exploded into violence. In Surabaya, November 1945, one of the fiercest urban battles in Southeast Asia, British troops, including Indian soldiers, clashed with Indonesian fighters. It was chaos. It was war. It was a bloodbath. Thousands died. The city was destroyed. But it proved one thing. Indonesia would fight. To the very last man. Guerrilla warfare and the people's resistance from 1945 to 1949. Indonesia became a war zone, but this wasn't a war of tanks or fighter jets. This was guerrilla warfare. Fighters disappeared into jungles after every strike. Villages became hideouts. Women carried secret messages. Children acted as lookouts. Farmers became soldiers overnight. The Dutch tried to crush the rebellion with massive police actions. But every town they captured vanished back into the jungle. It was a war of willpower, and the Indonesians weren't backing down. the world begins to notice. Images of scorched villages, civilians slaughtered, freedom fighters imprisoned. They reached the global press, and the world began to ask, what is the Netherlands really doing in Indonesia? Even the United Nations took notice, and slowly, international pressure began to mount. Why the Dutch refused to let go? But why were the Dutch so desperate to hold on? One word: economics. Indonesia wasn't just another colony. It was the crown jewel of the Dutch Empire. Oil, rubber, tin, spices, resources the Netherlands desperately needed. Especially after the devastation of World War II, losing Indonesia meant economic collapse, but keeping it meant endless war. Still, they tried. Again. By 1947, a new global conflict had begun. And the US was watching closely. They feared that starving, oppressed countries might turn to communism. Indonesia became a pawn in a global chess game. Behind the scenes, the CIA began favoring the Indonesian Republican leaders. The UN demanded negotiations. The Dutch agreed, then backed out, then agreed again, only to launch more attacks. Trust was gone. Hope was fading. And then came the final straw. In December 1948, the Dutch launched a surprise assault, Operation Cry. They captured Yogyakarta, the Republican capital. They arrested Sukarno and Hatta. They tried to decapitate the independence movement in one bold move. But this time, the world exploded in outrage. India and Australia led protests at the UN. America threatened to cut off Marshall Plan aid to the Netherlands. The message was clear. Let Indonesia go, or face the consequences. And it worked. Freedom. Finally, by mid-1949, under crushing international pressure, the Dutch finally agreed to negotiations. On December 27, 1949, they formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. Indonesia was free. Officially. But the scars of war would remain forever. The cost of freedom: over 100,000 Indonesians lost their lives. Cities were destroyed. Entire families vanished. A nation had been reborn, but through blood and fire. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a handover. Freedom was taken, earned, paid for, with everything. Legacy. Why it still matters today. Indonesia is the third largest and the most populous Muslim-majority nation on earth, but its struggle for independence remains a powerful reminder that peace doesn't arrive just because a war ends, that colonialism doesn't die with surrender, that freedom, real freedom, is fought for, not given. So the next time someone tells you that World War II ended in 1945, ask them this: did it really end for Indonesia? Or was that just the beginning of their greatest battle? These are the stories your history books forgot, and at HistoriSync we bring them back to life. If you crave forgotten wars, untold struggles, and real human stories that changed, subscribe now, because history isn't over. We're just beginning to understand it.